The water off the coast of Honshu glittered under the late afternoon sun on August 11, 1944. Commander Richard O'Kane stood in the conning tower of USS Tang, his eyes pressed against the attack periscope, watching two Japanese freighters materialize through the haze. Behind him, the Torpedo Data Computer hummed quietly, its electromechanical brain already beginning to digest the problem that would unfold over the next 20 minutes. O'Kane didn't know it yet, but within the hour, one of those freighters would explode so violently that her boiler would simply disintegrate, sending a column of steam and debris hundreds of feet into the sky. What he also didn't know was that the escort destroyer racing toward Tang's position had exactly 60 seconds to save itself once the TDC locked onto a solution. This wasn't hyperbole. It was mathematics rendered in brass and steel. The story of how American submarines came to possess what was essentially a mechanical oracle, a machine that could predict the future position of enemy ships and guide torpedoes to intercept them with near certainty, begins not with the submarines themselves, but with a problem that had vexed naval engineers since 1866, when Robert Whitehead invented the self-propelled torpedo. The problem was deceptively simple. How do you hit a moving target with a weapon that travels in a straight line? The torpedo itself couldn't turn. It had no eyes, no brain, no ability to adjust its course once it left the tube. It would run true and straight on whatever heading you gave it, propelled by steam or electricity, and it would either strike its target or miss entirely based on calculations made in the seconds before firing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For most of naval history, the answer to the torpedo problem had been brutally straightforward. Point your ship at where you think the enemy will be. Get as close as possible. Fire a spread of torpedoes to increase your chances, and hope. This worked adequately for surface ships in fleet actions, where multiple ships could coordinate their attacks and saturate an area with torpedoes. But for submarines, operating alone in hostile waters, often submerged and always vulnerable, such improvisation was a recipe for disaster. A submarine that needed to point itself directly at a target's future position before firing was a submarine that had to maneuver extensively, make noise, and spend precious time closing the geometry. Time that could be spent being detected, time that could get you killed. During World War I, submarine commanders used mechanical calculators and slide rules devices called angle solvers to work out the problem. The Mark VIII angle solver, colloquially known as the banjo for its distinctive shape, and the is-was circular slide rule, could help predict where a target would be based on where it was now and where it had been moments ago. These were crude instruments, prone to error, and they provided only a snapshot solution, a single answer frozen in time. If the target changed course, if your submarine changed position, if any variable shifted after you'd done your calculations, you had to start over. Submarine commanders in the First World War found these tools woefully inaccurate, which is why doctrine called for firing torpedoes in spreads, multiple weapons launched simultaneously at slightly different angles, hoping that at least one would find its mark. The United States Navy recognized this limitation. In 1932, the Bureau of Ordnance initiated a program with Armour Corporation and Ford Instruments to develop something revolutionary, not merely a calculator, but a continuous fire control computer that could track a target in real time and automatically adjust the firing solution as circumstances changed. What they created was the Torpedo Data Computer, specifically the Mark III variant, that would equip every American fleet submarine by the time war broke out in 1941. The TDC Mark III was unlike anything else in the world. To understand its significance, you must first understand what it replaced. Other navies, Germany, Britain, Japan, developed their own electromechanical torpedo calculators during the interwar period. These were sophisticated devices in their own right, capable of solving complex trigonometric equations to determine the proper gyro angle for a torpedo. The gyro angle was the critical variable. It told the torpedo's internal gyroscope to hold a course different from that of the submarine. This meant you could fire a torpedo that would turn to a specific heading after leaving the tube, allowing the submarine to remain on its current course rather than laboriously maneuvering to point at the target. But these calculators, including the Japanese and German systems, shared a fundamental limitation. They provided a solution for a fixed moment in the future. You would input your target's observed course, speed, and bearing. The calculator would churn through the math and give you a gyro angle. You would then manually set that angle into each torpedo, one at a time. If the target changed course, or if more than a few minutes passed, your solution became obsolete. You had to recalculate, reset the torpedoes, and hope you still had time. The American TDC did something entirely different. It tracked. The TDC consisted of two integrated sections. The first, called the position keeper, functioned as a moving map of the tactical situation. It took continuous inputs from the submarine's gyro compass and pitometer log instruments that measured the submarine's own course and speed, and combined them with manual observations of the target, its bearing, estimated speed, course, and angle on the bow. The angle on the bow was particularly important. It described where the submarine was positioned relative to the target's heading, as if you were standing on the enemy ship's deck and looking back at where the submarine appeared to be. A 90-degree angle on the bow meant you were perpendicular to the target's course, the ideal attack position, because any errors in estimated speed would have minimal effect on the intercept calculation. Using this data, the position keeper continuously solved differential equations of motion, to predict where the target would be at any given moment. This wasn't a guess. It was a calculated projection based on observed behavior, updated every second as new information flowed into the machine. The second section, the angle solver, took the position keeper's output and combined it with the tactical properties of the torpedo, its speed, its running characteristics, the distance it needed to travel after leaving the tube before its gyroscope activated a distance called the reach. From this, the angle solver computed the required gyro angle, not once, but continuously. The gyro angle changed constantly as the submarine maneuvered, as the target moved, as the range shifted. The TDC recalculated the solution in real time, and here was the crucial innovation. It fed that gyro angle directly to all 10 torpedo tubes, simultaneously through an electromechanical linkage. A shaft called the spindle extended into each torpedo tube and physically rotated the gyroscope inside the torpedo, keeping it aligned with the constantly updating firing solution. This meant that at any given moment, every torpedo in Tang's forward and aft rooms was already set to the correct angle for an immediate shot. If Commander O'Kane said fire, the torpedo would launch on a course guaranteed to intercept the target based on the TDC's most recent calculation. There was no delay for manual input, no frantic setting of angles tube by tube, no risk that your solution had gone stale in the time it took to prepare the weapons. The TDC made the submarine's 10 torpedo tubes function as a single, integrated weapon system, all aimed by a tireless mechanical brain that never slept, never miscalculated, and never lost track of the geometry. No other navy in World War II possessed this capability. German U-boats used sophisticated angle solvers, but they could only compute a gyro angle for a fixed future moment. Japanese submarines employed similar technology devices that could even dead-reckon a target's position through smoke or mist, using a timer, but they lacked the position keeper, the continuous tracking, the real-time updating. British submarines relied on the Fruit machine, an angle solver that required manual input into each torpedo. These were good systems, they worked, but they were calculators, not fire control computers. They told you where to aim at a specific moment, not where to aim at every moment. The TDC required 2 additional crewmen, one expert in its maintenance, capable of keeping the delicate electromechanical components running in the humid, claustrophobic environment of a submarine's conning tower, and one operator who understood how to feed it data and interpret its outputs. It was bulky, filling precious space in an already cramped compartment. It drew power from the submarine's standard 110-volt AC circuit, with some components requiring rectified DC. It had hand cranks, dials, switches, and odometer-style displays that showed the bearing to the target, the submarine's position, and the constantly shifting gyro angles. But it gave American submarine commanders a weapon that bordered on prescience. To generate an optimal firing solution, doctrine called for taking target bearings at intervals over a period of 15 to 20 minutes. The TDC needed this time to refine its calculations, to filter out errors, to build a confident picture of the target's true course and speed. Estimating an enemy ship's course was one of the hardest parts of the problem. From a periscope, you might see a ship's bow angle, its apparent direction, but translating that into a precise heading required experience and patience. The TDC helped by comparing successive observations. If your estimated course matched what the TDC predicted based on earlier data points, you knew you were on target. If the solution drifted, you adjusted your estimates and let the machine recalculate. Those 15 to 20 minutes of tracking were an investment. Once made, they paid continuous dividends. The TDC didn't forget. It didn't need to start over if something changed. It adapted. This brings us back to the water off Honshu, to Tang, and to the destroyer that was about to learn exactly what 60 seconds of reaction time meant when facing an American submarine. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was well aware that they had a problem. American submarines were everywhere. They lurked off the home islands, patrolled the shipping lanes to the resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, intercepted troop convoys bound for isolated garrisons in the Pacific. Japanese merchant tonnage losses were catastrophic. In the first months of the war, submarines had been a nuisance. By 1944, they were an existential threat. Japan's economy depended on imported oil, rubber, raw materials, and food. American submarines were severing those arteries one torpedo at a time. The Japanese High Command understood the need for effective anti-submarine warfare. In November of 1943, they organized the Grand Escort Fleet, a formation specifically designed to protect convoys. They developed tactical doctrines, invested in sonar and listening gear, built specialized escort vessels called kaibokan, coast defense ships that were the Japanese equivalent of destroyer escorts or corvettes. By 1944, they had improved their radar, their radio direction finding, their coordination between air and surface assets. But there was a problem embedded deep in Japanese naval culture, a problem that no amount of technology or tactical innovation could fully overcome. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not believe convoy escort was a job worthy of a warrior. Japanese naval doctrine, inherited from the decisive victory at Tsushima in 1905 and refined through decades of planning for a climactic fleet engagement, emphasized aggressive surface combat. Destroyers were built for speed. Armed with the finest torpedoes in the world, the oxygen-fueled Type 93 Long Lance, and trained for night surface actions, where they would close with enemy capital ships and deliver devastating torpedo. Salvos. This was the path to glory. This was what a destroyer was meant to do. Escorting slow merchant ships, patrolling at walking speed, listening passively for submarines, this was dull, unglamorous work. When asked about anti-submarine duty, one Japanese destroyer commander reportedly said, "We are not trained to accompany merchant vessels, but to fight a fleet action." Even as the submarine threat grew, even as the losses mounted, destroyer crews saw convoy escorts beneath them, a waste of ships designed for battle. The psychological mismatch between mission and mindset created gaps in performance that American submarines ruthlessly exploited. Japanese destroyers did possess good equipment. Their underwater listening gear, passive hydrophones, was excellent, capable of detecting submerged submarines at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, when the destroyer was stopped or moving very slowly. This was comparable to Allied equipment. Their echo-ranging gear, what the Allies called sonar or ASDIC, was more primitive, roughly equivalent to early American QC sonar from around 1937, but it worked. Japanese doctrine called for manning the hydrophone continuously and operating the echo-ranging gear at least 15 minutes every hour. On paper, this should have made Japanese escorts formidable opponents. But there were limitations. Japanese sonar was generally ineffective at speeds over 10 knots. The noise of a ship moving through water, the rush of the bow wave, the cavitation of propellers, the general turbulence overwhelmed the sensitive hydrophones. This meant that to use their detection gear effectively, Japanese escorts had to slow down, adopt what would later be called sprint and drift tactics, brief bursts of speed to close on a suspected contact, followed by long periods of near danger to listen. For a destroyer designed to make 35 knots, this was frustrating, even humiliating work. More critically, Japanese anti-submarine forces faced a doctrinal problem that persisted throughout the war. They had no reliable method for determining the depth of an enemy submarine. Unlike Allied forces, who developed increasingly sophisticated depth-finding techniques as the war progressed, Japanese depth charge attacks relied on pattern coverage. They would drop charges set to detonate at multiple depths, shallow, medium, and deep, hoping that at least one pattern would bracket the target. Early in the war, fleet destroyers carried remarkably few depth charges, sometimes as few as none at all, with priority given to torpedo armament for surface combat. By 1944, most destroyers carried approximately 30 depth charges. Escort vessels carried more, sometimes up to 120, but these were smaller, slower ships with less sophisticated fire control. The Japanese depth charges themselves were effective weapons when properly deployed, but there was a persistent problem with depth settings. For much of the war, Japanese depth charges were set to detonate too shallowly. This wasn't entirely their fault. In 1943, U.S. Congressman Andrew J. May, in a spectacular breach of operational security, publicly revealed that Japanese depth charges weren't being set deep enough to destroy American submarines. Whether May's disclosure directly prompted the Japanese to adjust their tactics remains unclear, but what is certain is that Japanese anti-submarine warfare grew more effective in the war's latter half, particularly after radar became more widely available in late 1944. Even with improved equipment and doctrine, Japanese escorts suffered from a crucial weakness: a lack of persistence. American submarine commanders noted repeatedly that Japanese escorts would drop a pattern of depth charges, observe the results, and if they saw any debris or an oil slick, or even just assumed they'd made a kill based on their own hopeful assessment, they would depart. Many American submarines owed their survival to this Japanese tendency to accept the most optimistic interpretation of events. A submarine that might have been damaged or forced to the surface with continued pressure was instead allowed to escape because the escort commander convinced himself the job was done. This psychological factor, the reluctance to engage in the tedious, methodical work of hunting a submarine to death, was compounded by practical limitations. Communication between escorts in a convoy was often poor. There was no unified control system. Different escort areas used different communication protocols, making cooperation between neighboring commanders difficult. Even within a single convoy, coordination between escorts was inadequate. This wasn't due to lack of technology but to lack of institutional priority. The Imperial Japanese Navy had simply never developed the culture of anti-submarine warfare that the British Royal Navy had been forced to develop over 2 world wars. Into this environment came American submarines equipped with the TDC. The typical American torpedo attack in the Pacific followed a pattern that Commander O'Kane and his contemporaries knew intimately. First came detection. A mast on the horizon, smoke from a ship's stack, telltale shape of a convoy spotted through the periscope. Then came the approach, often lasting hours, as the submarine maneuvered to gain a favorable attack position. During this phase, the TDC was already working. The operator would input initial estimates, target course, speed, range, and the machine would begin tracking. Periscope observations were dangerous. Every time you raised the scope, you risked detection. Japanese lookouts were good, and a periscope feather, the small wake created by the scope cutting through the water, could be spotted by trained eyes, especially in calm seas. But the TDC's tracking ability meant you didn't need continuous periscope exposure. You could take a bearing, duck down, wait several minutes, take another bearing, compare. The TDC was integrating these observations, building a picture of the target's motion over time. The optimal firing range for an American submarine was typically between 600 and 2,500 yards, roughly a third of a mile to about a mile and a half. Some commanders preferred to get much closer, inside 1,000 yards, where the torpedo runtime was so short that the target had little chance to maneuver. Others preferred longer shots that gave them more escape time. It depended on the situation, the target's value, and the commander's temperament. At 45 knots, the standard setting for a Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon fired from 1,700 yards, would reach its target in approximately 80 seconds. During those 80 seconds, a merchant ship traveling at 12 knots would move roughly 460 yards, nearly 5 ship lengths for a typical cargo vessel. This illustrated the fundamental problem. If you aimed at where the ship was when you fired, the torpedo would pass harmlessly behind the stern. You had to aim at where the ship would be. The TDC solved this continuously, automatically, and relentlessly. But here's where the 60-second figure becomes relevant, and here's where the story of Tang off Honshu on August 11th intersects with the larger strategic reality of the Pacific War. When a Japanese destroyer detected a submarine attack when torpedoes were spotted in the water, or when a merchant ship in the convoy suddenly erupted in flames, the destroyer had to make an immediate decision. Where was the submarine? The torpedo's wake might give a bearing, the direction from which the weapon had come, but that only told you where the submarine had been roughly 90 seconds ago when it fired. Where was it now? A submerged submarine in 1944 could make perhaps 8 or 9 knots underwater. In 60 seconds, it could move perhaps 250 yards, maybe 300 if it was sprinting and accepting the risk of making noise. But which direction? Toward you? Away? Parallel to the convoy? For a Japanese destroyer equipped with an angle solver but not a tracking computer, the problem was brutally difficult. You could calculate a firing solution for your own torpedoes or guns if you could see the target and estimate its position. But you couldn't track a submarine you couldn't see, underwater, maneuvering unpredictably. You had to guess. You had to rely on doctrine, on probability, on experience. American submarines, by contrast, knew exactly where their targets were at every moment, continuously updated by the TDC. More importantly, they could fire from positions that didn't require the submarine to be pointed directly at the target. The TDC's gyro angle calculation meant that Tang could be running parallel to a convoy, perpendicular to the merchant ship's course, and still put torpedoes into targets. The destroyer trying to find Tang after the attack would be searching based on the torpedo tracks, which pointed in a completely different direction from the submarine's actual course. This geometric flexibility was the TDC's most profound tactical advantage. It turned the submarine into a vessel that could fire from unexpected angles, that could continue maneuvering even as torpedoes were in the tubes, that could shoot and then immediately turn away, rather than having to hold course while the weapons ran. For the escorts, this made the post-attack search exponentially more difficult. Now layer on top of this the TDC's continuous updating capability. Imagine you're Commander O'Kane, 15 minutes into your tracking approach. You've taken 4 or 5 periscope observations. The TDC has refined its solution. You're confident in your data. The gyro angles are set. But then the convoy zigs makes a course change. On a German or Japanese submarine, this would be a disaster. You'd have to recalculate everything, reset all your torpedoes manually, potentially lose your attack opportunity. On Tang, the TDC simply adjusts. The target's new course flows into the position keeper, the angle solver recalculates. Within seconds, literally seconds, the gyro angles update throughout the boat. You don't reset anything manually. You don't lose your solution. The machine adapts faster than a human could write down the new problem. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This adaptability extended to the moment of firing. Say O'Kane decided to fire a spread of 3 torpedoes. The first would be set to the TDC's calculated gyro angle, the optimal solution. The second might be set with a slight divergence, perhaps 2 degrees to the left, to account for possible errors in target speed. The third might diverge 2 degrees right. This spread pattern, automatically generated by the TDC, ensured that even if one variable was slightly wrong, if the target was actually making 14 knots instead of 12, or if its course was 5 degrees different from what you'd estimated, at least one torpedo would likely hit. The TDC could control all 10 tubes independently, setting different gyro angles for each weapon if necessary. In a convoy attack, you might fire your forward tubes at one target and your aft tubes at another, both attacks happening simultaneously, both guided by the same fire control solution, both adjusted in real time as the geometry shifted. This brings us back to the 60-second window, but we need to understand it more precisely. The number isn't literal in the sense that the TDC completed all its calculations in exactly 60 seconds. Rather, 60 seconds represents the approximate time between when a Japanese destroyer first detected an attack was underway and when it would have needed to have already been in an optimal counterattack position to have any chance of immediately threatening the submarine. Let's walk through the sequence. A Japanese convoy is steaming at 12 knots. USS Tang is at periscope depth, 1,700 yards off the starboard beam of a large freighter. The TDC has been tracking for 18 minutes. O'Kane has taken 7 periscope observations. The solution is solid. He orders, "Make ready forward tubes 1 through 4, set depth 10 feet. The torpedomen confirm." The TDC continuously updates the gyro angles being fed to the torpedoes in their tubes. O'Kane waits for the optimal moment, not just when the geometry is perfect, but when Tang is in a position to escape after firing. He wants to shoot and turn away immediately, putting distance between his boat and the inevitable counterattack. The TDC doesn't care about O'Kane's maneuvering. It tracks the target independently of Tang's course. As Tang turns, the gyro angles adjust automatically to compensate. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, fire 4. 4 torpedoes leave the forward tubes in rapid succession, roughly 5 seconds apart. Each torpedo travels straight for roughly 100 yards the reach distance before its gyroscope activates. Then, each turns to its preset heading, angling toward the intercept point the TDC calculated. From the surface, these 4 tracks spread slightly, forming a fan pattern that brackets the target. 90 seconds later, 3 of the 4 torpedoes strike the freighter. 1 hits forward of the bridge. 1 strikes amidships, detonating in or near the engine room. 1 hits aft, near the propeller shafts. The freighter breaks in 2 and begins to sink within minutes. Now the destroyer escorts react. They see the torpedo tracks. They know approximately where the submarine was. But Tang has been maneuvering for 90 seconds since firing, turning away, diving deeper, changing course. The destroyer must sprint toward the estimated firing position, arrive there, slow down to use its sonar, and begin searching. By the time it's in a position to establish sonar contact, Tang is potentially half a mile from where the destroyer thought it would be, at a depth the destroyer can only guess at, moving in a direction the destroyer has no way to predict. The 60 seconds is the window in which the destroyer would have needed to already be close enough, already have sonar contact, already be in a position to attack, to catch Tang before Tang's maneuvering made the search problem unmanageable, and that 60 seconds had already elapsed before the torpedoes even hit their target. This is why American submarines achieved such devastating success rates in the Pacific. It wasn't just that they had better torpedoes, though once the Mark 14's problems were fixed in mid-1943, they did. It wasn't just that they had better training, though they did. It was that they possessed a fire control system that operated on a fundamentally different level from anything their opponents could field. The Japanese destroyers were fighting a reactive war. They responded to attacks after they happened, searched for submarines based on guesswork and probability, and hoped their depth charges were set to the right depth. American submarines fought a predictive war. They knew where their targets would be before their targets arrived there. They fired from positions that maximized survival. They used mathematics as a force multiplier. Consider the broader numbers. The U.S. submarine force in the Pacific consisted of fewer than 200 boats on average at any given time during the war. These boats represented roughly 2% of the U.S. Navy's total manpower. Yet they were responsible for 55% of all Japanese shipping sunk during the war, over 1,300 ships totaling more than 5 million tons. They sank one Japanese aircraft carrier, on average, every 3 months. They destroyed the battleship Kongo, the only Japanese battleship sunk by a submarine. They killed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers aboard troop transports, disrupted supply lines, and by the war's end, had reduced Japan's merchant marine to less than a quarter of its December 1941 tonnage. This came at a terrible cost. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, with 3,500 officers and men killed, a casualty rate of roughly 20%, the highest of any U.S. military service. But the exchange ratio was extraordinary. For every submarine lost, the Japanese lost dozens of ships. The TDC was not the only reason for this success. American submarines benefited from excellent intelligence, from the breaking of Japanese naval codes, from improved tactics developed over years of combat experience. They benefited from their boats' range and endurance, from their crews' training, from the material superiority of American industry. But the TDC was the technological foundation that made everything else possible. It was the tool that let skilled commanders exploit opportunities, that let aggressive captains take calculated risks, that made the submarine a precision instrument rather than a blunt weapon. Back on Tang that August afternoon, the first freighter had barely sunk before O'Kane was tracking the second. The TDC had never stopped working. While the first attack unfolded, while torpedoes were running, while the target exploded, the machine continued solving the fire control problem for every other ship in sight. O'Kane could fire at the second target immediately if he chose, or he could wait, let the escorts rush toward where they thought he was, and then shoot again from a different position entirely. He chose to wait. 2 escorts were indeed charging toward Tang's previous firing position, their screws thrashing the water audibly through Tang's hull. O'Kane took the boat deep, went quiet, let them pass overhead. They dropped depth charges. O'Kane counted them, felt the concussions, assessed the damage, which was nil. The charges detonated too shallow, too far away. The escorts weren't using a systematic search pattern. They were guessing, hoping, reacting emotionally rather than tactically. After 38 minutes, Tang returned to periscope depth. The escorts were elsewhere, still searching the wrong patch of ocean. The second freighter was limping away, protected now by only 1 escort. O'Kane maneuvered into position. The TDC tracked. After a suitable interval, Tang fired 3 more torpedoes. 1 struck the freighter in the boilers. The target didn't just sink, it exploded, disintegrating so completely that debris rained down for nearly a minute. The boiler, breached by a 500 to 30-pound Torpex warhead, released its superheated steam in a catastrophic pressure failure that ripped the ship apart from the inside. The escort destroyer, seeing this, finally turned and came directly at Tang's position. This was the moment when training and doctrine mattered. A well-coordinated anti-submarine attack required patience, systematic searching, the kind of methodical hunting that Japanese destroyer crews found psychologically intolerable. Instead, the destroyer charged, hoping to force Tang deep, hoping to get lucky with a snap depth charge attack. Tang went deep and increased speed. The TDC, no longer needed for the moment, was secured. The destroyer passed overhead, dropped a pattern, missed by a wide margin. By the time the escort could turn and slow down to use its sonar, Tang was gone, masked by thermal layers in the water, concealed by its own silent running procedures, invisible. O'Kane would later write that the key to the attack wasn't bravery, though courage certainly mattered, but rather the confidence that came from knowing your solution was correct. When the TDC said your torpedoes would hit, they hit. When the TDC gave you a firing position, you didn't second-guess it. You trusted the mathematics, executed the attack, and maneuvered away. The machine removed uncertainty from the equation, and in doing so, removed a significant portion of the psychological burden that submarine commanders had carried since torpedoes were invented. This psychological dimension is often overlooked in technical histories, but it was crucial. Submarine combat in World War II was fundamentally a battle of wills as much as weapons. You were enclosed in a steel tube, underwater, blind except for brief periscope glimpses, hunted by ships that could hear you and kill you if they found you. The stress was immense. Commanders who doubted their firing solutions hesitated. Hesitation meant missed opportunities, or worse, it meant staying too long in a dangerous position, exposing the boat to counterattack. The TDC didn't eliminate fear, nothing could, but it eliminated doubts about mathematics. You might doubt whether you'd correctly estimated the target's speed. You might worry about whether the torpedoes would actually explode, a very real concern in 1942 and early 1943, when the Mark 14's multiple design flaws were still being discovered and fixed. But you didn't doubt the TDC's calculations. If you fed it accurate data, it gave you an accurate solution. The machine was trustworthy in a way that slide rules and manual calculations could never be. Japanese destroyer commanders had no such confidence. Their angle solvers could compute a correct solution for a fixed moment, but that moment was always in the past by the time the calculations were complete. Their fire control was static, not dynamic. They were constantly playing catch-up, constantly reacting, constantly uncertain. This uncertainty bred hesitation, and hesitation in anti-submarine warfare was fatal to your chances of killing the submarine, if not fatal to you personally. The technological gap between American and Japanese submarine warfare capabilities widened as the war progressed, but not in the way you might expect. Japanese engineers understood the principles of fire control computing. They had developed sophisticated torpedo fire control systems for their surface ships, systems that could calculate intercept solutions for their devastating long-lance torpedoes. Japanese submarine designers knew that continuous tracking was theoretically superior to snapshot calculations. The knowledge existed. What didn't exist was the institutional infrastructure to develop, produce, and deploy such systems at scale while fighting a two-ocean war. American submarines benefited from something more fundamental than just good technology. They benefited from an industrial base that could produce precision electromechanical instruments in quantity, maintain them in the field, and continuously improve them based on combat feedback. The TDC Mark III wasn't a perfect system when it first entered service. Early models had reliability issues. The mechanical integrators that solved the differential equations were sensitive to vibration and humidity. The electrical connections between the TDC and the torpedo tubes sometimes failed, but American industry could iterate, could fix problems, could produce replacement parts and ship them to forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Midway. By late 1943, a revised version called the TDC Mark IV entered service, designed to support the new Mark 18 electric torpedo. Electric torpedoes ran cooler and left no visible wake, making them much harder to detect than the steam-powered Mark 14s. The TDC Mark IV incorporated refinements learned from 2 years of combat operations. Its mechanical components were more robust, its calculations were more accurate. But fundamentally, it worked on the same principles as the Mark III: continuous target tracking, real-time gyro angle updates, integrated fire control. Japanese destroyers, meanwhile, received incremental improvements to their anti-submarine equipment, but these improvements couldn't close the fundamental gap in capability. By September of 1944, many Japanese escorts finally received surface search radar in quantity. This was a significant upgrade. Radar allowed detection of surfaced submarines at night, when American boats often ran on the surface to recharge batteries and transit at higher speeds. But radar couldn't detect submerged submarines, and by late 1944, American submarines had become adept at crash diving when caught on the surface, disappearing beneath the waves in less than 60 seconds. The radar also came with a limitation. American submarines carried radar detectors. These devices could sense when they were being painted by enemy radar, giving them warning to dive before visual contact was made. This turned radar into a double-edged sword for Japanese escorts. Yes, they could detect submarines at longer ranges, but the submarines knew they were being detected and could react accordingly. The grinding arithmetic of the submarine war favored the Americans in almost every dimension. Consider the reload times. On a Balao-class submarine like Tang, reloading a forward torpedo tube under ideal conditions took approximately 5 to 10 minutes. This required a crew of 6 to 8 men to maneuver the 3,400-pound Mark 14 torpedo from the storage rack, align it with the tube, and push it into position using block and tackle systems. In rough seas or during evasive maneuvers, reload times could stretch to 15 or 20 minutes. But once the new torpedo was in the tube, the TDC immediately began feeding it the current gyro angle. There was no separate setup process. The weapon was ready to fire as soon as it was loaded. Japanese destroyers, responding to a submarine attack, faced a much more complicated problem. If they wanted to drop depth charges, they needed to be directly over or very near the estimated submarine position. Depth charges were short-range weapons, effective only within a few dozen yards of detonation. The destroyer had to sprint to where it thought the submarine was, slow down to use sonar, acquire a contact, classify it as genuine rather than a false echo, approach the contact, and then drop a pattern of charges set to various depths. Each step consumed time during which the submarine was maneuvering, going deeper, changing course, exploiting thermal layers in the water that bent sonar beams and created shadow zones. If the first attack missed, and it usually did, the destroyer had to turn around, reacquire the contact, and attack again. This could take many minutes. Meanwhile, the submarine might fire another spread of torpedoes at a different target in the convoy, forcing the destroyer to choose: continue hunting the submarine it was tracking, or break off to protect the other ships. This tactical dilemma appeared repeatedly in action reports. Japanese escorts were perpetually caught between offensive and defensive priorities. If they stayed with the convoy, they provided protection, but allowed the submarine to attack from beyond their effective sonar range. If they charged after the submarine, they left the convoy less protected and often failed to catch the submarine anyway. American doctrine, refined through brutal experience, emphasized what submarine commanders called the down-the-throat shot firing directly at an approaching escort. This was psychologically difficult, requiring you to hold position while a destroyer came straight at you, but it was tactically sound. The escort presented a narrow profile, yes, but it was also moving in a predictable straight line, making the TDC's solution simpler. More importantly, a destroyer that ate a torpedo was a destroyer that couldn't hunt you. Even if you missed, the destroyer would often veer away to avoid the torpedo track, disrupting its attack run and giving you time to escape. Commander Richard O'Kane became particularly famous for this tactic. On Tang's fourth war patrol, the one we've been discussing, O'Kane engaged escorts directly on multiple occasions. On August 22nd, Tang encountered a 225-foot patrol boat. O'Kane fired a single torpedo at 1,200 yards. The patrol boat disintegrated. The next day, Tang spotted a large transport with Japanese personnel visible on the superstructure and bridge, probably troop transport, 8,000 tons. O'Kane closed to firing range, took his time with the TDC tracking, and put 2 torpedoes into the target. The transport, later identified as Tsukushi Maru, sank stern first in deep water. 2 days after that, Tang sank a tanker and its escort in rapid succession. The escort, realizing it was under attack, turned toward Tang's position. O'Kane fired 3 torpedoes straight at the approaching warship. 1 struck forward. The escort exploded and sank within minutes. The tanker, now unprotected, was an easy follow-up shot. This was the pattern throughout late 1944. American submarines finding convoys, tracking them with the TDC, firing spreads that often achieved 70 to 80% hit rates among experienced commanders, and then either evading the escorts or actively engaging them. The Japanese simply couldn't match this operational tempo. Let's examine the specific mathematics of why 60 seconds mattered so much, because the number isn't arbitrary, it emerges from the geometry and physics of the engagement. A submerged submarine in 1944, depending on class and battery condition, could make between 8 and 9 knots maximum underwater speed. Most submarines ran slower to conserve battery power, perhaps 6 or 7 knots during an approach, dropping to 3 or 4 knots when trying to remain silent. But in an emergency, running after firing torpedoes and knowing escorts were converging, a submarine could sprint at 8 or 9 knots for a limited period. In 60 seconds at 8 knots, a submarine travels approximately 270 yards. That's nearly 3 football fields. But it's not just about distance, it's about the cone of uncertainty. If the escort knows only that the submarine was at position X when it fired, and that was 90 seconds ago, the torpedo runtime, then the submarine could now be anywhere within a circle roughly 500 yards in radius from position X. That's an area of nearly 800,000 square yards, about 160 acres of ocean to search. Now factor in depth. A fleet submarine could dive to approximately 400 feet, though most attacks were conducted from periscope depth at around 60 feet. After firing, the submarine would often go deep down to 200, 250, 300 feet, putting distance between itself and the surface, where the escorts operated. Sonar range decreased with depth due to the way sound propagated through water. Temperature gradients created layers where sonar effectiveness dropped dramatically. The escort's sonar, operating at the surface, had a maximum effective range of perhaps 3,000 yards under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions were rare. More commonly, effective range was closer to 1,500 to 2,000 yards. The sonar beam was highly directional. It could look in one bearing at a time. To search that 800,000 square yard area, the escort had to slowly rotate its sonar, ping, listen for returns, rotate to the next bearing, ping again. This took time. Lots of time. Even after detecting a contact, classification was difficult. Sonar returns could come from schools of fish, from thermal boundaries in the water, from wrecks on the bottom, from the turbulence left behind by a submarine that was no longer there. Japanese sonar operators had to distinguish real contacts from false ones, and unlike their American counterparts, they didn't have extensive experience or training in this specific task. American destroyer escort crews trained extensively in anti-submarine warfare because that was their primary mission. Japanese destroyer crews trained primarily for surface combat and treated anti-submarine work as a secondary duty. This training gap manifested in patterns that American submarine commanders learned to exploit. Japanese escorts were predictable. After a submarine attack, they almost always charged directly down the bearing indicated by the torpedo tracks. They almost always dropped their first depth charge pattern quickly, often while still moving at relatively high speed, which meant their own noise-masked sonar returns. They almost always accepted marginal evidence of a kill, an oil slick, some debris, and departed prematurely. There were exceptions, of course. Some Japanese escort commanders were skilled and persistent. Some attacks were well coordinated, with multiple escorts working together to hem in a submarine and force it to the surface, but these were exceptions. The rule was that Japanese anti-submarine efforts were reactive, rushed, and insufficiently persistent. By contrast, when American destroyers and destroyer escorts hunted German U-boats in the Atlantic, they brought lessons learned from the British: systematic search patterns, coordinated attacks with multiple ships, willingness to hunt a submarine for hours or even days. They used Hedgehog, a forward-firing weapon that let them maintain sonar contact while attacking. They used depth charges set to precise depths based on calculated estimates. They had trained operators, established doctrine, institutional knowledge built over years of brutal warfare. The Japanese never developed this institutional competence in anti-submarine warfare because, fundamentally, they never fully committed to it as a priority. Even as the submarine threat became existential in 1944 and 1945, even as shipping losses threatened to starve Japan of resources, the Imperial Japanese Navy continued to prioritize offensive operations, surface combat, and defense of the home islands over convoy protection. The escorts that did exist were often assigned to secondary duties or were poorly maintained due to lack of spare parts and repair facilities. There's a telling statistic from the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, compiled after the war. Japanese surface ships sank 17 American submarines during the entire Pacific War. Japanese aircraft sank another 8. One submarine was sunk in a shared action between surface ships and aircraft. That's 26 American submarines lost to Japanese anti-submarine efforts, about half of the total American submarine losses. The rest were lost to mines, operational accidents, friendly fire, or unknown causes. Given that American submarines conducted thousands of war patrols, engaged in hundreds of attacks, and operated in some of the most heavily defended waters in the world, the low number of Japanese anti-submarine kills is remarkable. It speaks to a fundamental failure, not of equipment or individual courage, but of doctrine, training, and institutional commitment. Now, contrast this with what American submarines achieved. 1,152 Japanese merchant ships sunk, totaling nearly 5 million gross tons. That's 98% of all Allied submarine successes in the Pacific. Add to this the naval vessels: 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 11 cruisers, dozens of destroyers and smaller warships. The exchange ratio wasn't close. It wasn't even comparable. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who commanded the Japanese submarine I-58 and famously sank the cruiser Indianapolis in the war's final weeks, wrote after the war about the difference between Japanese and American submarine operations. He noted that American submarines seemed to always know where Japanese ships would be, that they attacked from unexpected angles, that their torpedoes rarely missed when they chose to fire. Hashimoto attributed this partly to American intelligence, which was indeed excellent, thanks to code breaking, but he also recognized that American submarines possessed superior fire control. He didn't know about the TDC specifically, at least not in detail, but he understood that the Americans had somehow automated the targeting process in a way that Japanese submarines hadn't. Japanese submariners, ironically, were not the primary beneficiaries of whatever anti-submarine technology Japan did develop. The Imperial Japanese Navy used its submarines primarily for attacks on warships, guerre d'escadre, fleet versus fleet warfare, rather than commerce raiding. This was a strategic mistake that cost them dearly. Japanese submarines spent much of the war hunting American carriers and battleships, targets that were fast, heavily escorted, and difficult to sink. Meanwhile, American cargo ships full of supplies, troops, and equipment steamed across the Pacific, relatively unmolested. When Japanese submarines did attack merchant shipping, they were often successful. But there were simply too few attacks on too few targets to make a strategic difference. By contrast, American submarines attacked anything that floated and flew a Japanese flag. Merchant ships, tankers, troop transports, fishing boats, inter-island ferries if it was Japanese and it was at sea, it was a target. This unrestricted warfare, approved at the highest levels of command and executed ruthlessly by submarine crews, strangled Japan's economy. The human cost of this campaign was staggering on both sides. American submariners faced a 20% casualty rate, the highest of any American service. Of the 288 submarines that deployed to the Pacific, 52 never returned. 3,500 men died in those lost boats, most of them entombed in steel hulls on the ocean floor, their deaths instantaneous when depth charges ruptured pressure hulls, or slow when damaged submarines sank beyond crush depth. For Japanese merchant mariners, the toll was even worse. Japan entered the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping and nearly 122,000 merchant seamen. By the war's end, over 80% of the merchant fleet was gone, and more than half of the merchant seamen were dead 60,000 men. These were not combatants in the traditional sense. They were sailors, many of them civilians, manning cargo ships and tankers, but total war makes no such distinctions. The American submarines sank them without mercy, knowing that every ship sent to the bottom was a ship that couldn't carry oil from the Dutch East Indies, couldn't transport troops to New Guinea, couldn't deliver rice to a hungry garrison. The TDC made this industrialized killing more efficient. That's a grim way to phrase it, but it's accurate. The machine didn't make moral judgments. It calculated intercept solutions. It pointed torpedoes at targets. It helped submarine commanders hit what they aimed at. In the context of a war for survival, in the Pacific where Japan had initiated the conflict and committed countless atrocities, American submariners felt little remorse about sinking Japanese ships. They had a job to do, and the TDC helped them do it better. But there were moments that haunted them nonetheless. When you sank a troop transport and watched through the periscope as hundreds of soldiers struggled in the water, when you heard depth charges detonating above you and knew that men on those escort ships were just doing their duty like you were doing yours, when you surfaced after an engagement and found wreckage and bodies floating in the oil slicks, those images stayed with you. Commander O'Kane wrote about this after the war. He wrote about the excitement of successful attacks, the pride in Tang's achievements, but also about the cost. Tang's final patrol, her fifth, ended in tragedy. On October 24, 1944, Tang engaged a large convoy near Formosa. The attack was devastating. Tang sank multiple ships, evaded escorts, and maneuvered for a final attack on a damaged tanker. O'Kane fired his last 2 torpedoes. The first ran straight and true. The second broached, came to the surface, then curved in a circular run, a catastrophic malfunction. The errant torpedo came back toward Tang. O'Kane tried to maneuver clear, but there wasn't time. The torpedo struck Tang's stern, detonating, rupturing the pressure hull. Tang went down in 180 feet of water. 78 men died. Only 9 survived, including O'Kane, after escaping from the forward torpedo room using Momsen lungs, a primitive breathing apparatus. It was the only time in the war that Momsen lungs were successfully used to escape a sunk submarine. The circular run that killed Tang was a known but rare malfunction of the Mark 14 torpedo. Despite the weapon's problems being largely fixed by mid-1943, occasional failures still occurred. The gyroscope could fail, the steering mechanism could jam, the propulsion system could malfunction. Torpedoes were complex machines operating under tremendous Stress, water pressure, acceleration, the violence of being launched from a tube. Most worked as designed, some didn't. The TDC couldn't prevent torpedo malfunctions. It could calculate perfect firing solutions, but if the weapon itself failed, the solution was irrelevant. This was a humbling reminder that technology, however sophisticated, operates within limits. The TDC was remarkable, even revolutionary, but it wasn't infallible. It depended on accurate inputs from human observers. It depended on the submarine's navigation instruments working correctly. It depended on the torpedoes functioning as designed. Yet even with these limitations, even with the occasional malfunction or human error, the TDC gave American submarines an advantage so overwhelming that Japanese forces never found an effective counter. They tried. In late 1944 and early 1945, as the submarine threat became impossible to ignore, the Japanese military made desperate efforts to improve anti-submarine capabilities. They organized more escort squadrons, produced more Kaiboken vessels, improved their radar and sonar, and developed better tactics, but it was too late. American submarines had achieved sea control in much of the Pacific. They operated off the Japanese home islands with near impunity. In June of 1945, a wolf pack of American submarines even penetrated the Sea of Japan through the heavily mined Tsushima Strait, using new high-frequency sonar, specifically designed to detect mines. The Japanese had assumed the Sea of Japan was safe, a sanctuary where their remaining shipping could operate without threat. The presence of American submarines there, sinking ship after ship, was a profound shock. It demonstrated that nowhere was safe, that the Americans could go anywhere, anytime. The final months of the war saw American submarines conducting almost unopposed operations. Japanese escorts were scarce, fuel was scarcer, and coordination had broken down. Many Japanese ships simply tried to avoid contact, running at night, hugging the coast, hoping to escape detection. The hunting was, in a grim sense, easy. Submarines would pick up radar contacts close to firing position, track with the TDC, and fire spreads that rarely missed. This wasn't the desperate, close-quarters combat of the war's early years, when faulty torpedoes forced submarine commanders to close to knife-fighting range and hope their weapons would explode. This was methodical, calculated destruction. The submarine force had become, in effect, a strategic weapon. It had cut Japan's maritime lifelines as thoroughly as any blockade in history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.